Good morning and welcome. I'm Mackenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm very happy to welcome you all here today. I know that COVID-19 is one of many crises demanding public and press attention right now, so I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us. Today's conversation marks the 12th in a series we've hosted on the business and economic ramifications of the pandemic. And today we're going to be exploring the challenges facing workers and employers as more and more states reopen and more folks are heading back to work in person. We have a great cross-disciplinary series of experts we're going to be hearing from during the first half of the call. We have UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School professor Paige Ouimet. We have UNC Sociology professor Alexandria Ravenel. And we also have Professor Jeffrey Hirsch of the UNC School of Law, each tackling these questions from their own areas of expertise. We'll have a few minutes of insights from them in succession during the first half of the conversation. Then we're going to move into Q&A during the second half of today's webinar. So for reporters who are joining us by web, you are welcome to submit your questions at any point during the conversation using the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. Separately, for reporters joining us by phone, you are welcome to email me your questions at any point. My email address again is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. With that, I want to let our experts take things over and get things started. So it's my pleasure to hand things over to our first speaker, UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School professor Paige Ouimet. Paige?
Great. Thank you, Mackenzie. So getting workers who have been furloughed or laid off due to COVID back working is a critical but extraordinarily complex task. And so consistent with the complexity of the task, we are all going to talk about very different aspects of the challenge. And specifically, I am going to talk about a government program which can be of assistance to bringing back some workers into paid employment, but is often not fully understood. Short-time compensation and partial unemployment insurance. So short-time compensation, and you can really think of this as an alternative for firms to layoffs. So what a company does if they create a short-time compensation plan is they are going to reduce the number of layoffs they would otherwise do, and they do this by effectively sharing the available work across multiple employees. Once a firm has created this plan, they then file it with the state, and the affected employees can collect a portion of unemployment insurance reflecting compensation for the lost hours. So affected employees will see a decrease in their paychecks from their specific employer, and this is simply due to the reduction in working hours, but they will then also see this increase in compensation coming from the partial unemployment insurance, which will be paid proportional to the number of lost hours. Workers on short-time compensation also receive any other non-wage benefits, such as healthcare, that they would normally receive at their employer if they were working their full set of full-time hours. Now, to encourage such programs, Section 2108 of the CARES Act provided federal funding for 100% of short-time compensation paid by the 27 states that had such plans in place at the time of the act. The CARES Act also provided funding for states that were interested in adopting short-time compensation plans but had not previously adopted them. However, even in the absence of a formal short-time compensation plan, many of the same benefits can be achieved using partial unemployment insurance, and most states have partial unemployment insurance plans. So in many cases, these programs have been recently adopted. For example, on March 17th, Governor Cooper of North Carolina issued an executive order allowing workers in the state whose hours were cut to apply for partial unemployment insurance. Because these plans often vary by state, I will take the example of North Carolina. In North Carolina, workers who are earning less than $70 a week due to reduced hours and file for partial unemployment insurance will receive the full amount of unemployment insurance compensation. In other words, they receive the same amount of benefits they would receive as if they were working 0 hours. Beyond that, workers who are working enough hours to earn more than $70 per week will receive some sort of prorated portion of unemployment insurance compensation, up to the max allowed payment. Importantly, the worker is also eligible for the $600 supplement that is currently available as part of the CARES Act. So why do we care about these programs? Well, there are two main benefits. So first, it allows firms to retain more of its workers on its payrolls. Firms are able to keep those employees with experience and knowledge about their business. And as demand increases, these firms are going to be able to scale up more quickly. And in the meantime, distributing available hours over more workers helps to create a greater sense of equity across employees. Everyone is treated more equally. Second, smaller companies or companies that employ workers with specific unique skills may have concerns about bringing an employee back on payroll if they are unable to guarantee full hours. This may be a particular concern in light of the relatively generous UI benefits currently available. Firms would not want to deny their workers these benefits. However, partial unemployment insurance allows a firm to partially employ workers in a way that they realize no drop in total compensation, if we measure total compensation as both payments from the firm and transfers received as part of unemployment insurance payments, as compared to receiving the full allotment from unemployment insurance. This is also beneficial to workers. So partial unemployment insurance can help to reduce long-term unemployment. So we know from a number of studies that individuals with long-term unemployment, and this is what we typically define as unemployment for a period of 6 months or longer, face significant discrimination in the labor market. And so by keeping these workers attached to their firms, this reduces employment gaps in individual job histories. Also, by remaining employed, albeit partially, workers are able to better keep their skills current, making them more employable in the long run. And moreover, a number of studies have demonstrated that unemployment is linked to high levels of stress, family disruption, and lower health outcomes. Finally, retaining at least partial employment may help with consumer confidence and thus be a benefit of the broader economy. So a number of academic studies have tried to understand the overall welfare implications of these programs. For example, a recent study in Italy showed that the availability of a short-time work compensation program both stabilized employment and had positive welfare effects. A more recent study coming out of France shows similar findings and argues that short-time work compensation programs reduced inefficient job losses and led to a reduction in total government expenditures. So I want to conclude with an action item, which is to increase visibility of these programs. There is evidence that even in states with a long history of short-time compensation programs or partial UI, there is limited uptake due to a lack of awareness of these programs. For example, a recent study by the UNC Institute found that a modest advertising effort greatly increased awareness and participation in these programs. We need to get the word out and make sure firms and employees are aware of these programs. And so from here, I will pass it on to Alexandria Ravenel.
Great. Thank you so much, Paige. I really appreciate that. So thank you. I'm Alexandria Ravenel. I'm an assistant professor in sociology at UNC, and I'm working with a team of graduate students on an NSF-funded rapid research grant. Our project is looking at the impact of COVID on precarious and gig workers in New York City. And we're looking at New York City in particular because it was an early epicenter of the outbreak, where thankfully the curve is now on the way down. And because New York also has a large number of gig workers and 1099 or independent contractors. We define precarious work as including temporary contract-based work, gig work, and involuntary part-time work. This is work that is often insecure, provides limited economic and social benefits, has few labor law or regulatory protections. You can think here about minimum wage work, freelance work, and in many cases, some of the work that we started to identify as essential work. So we're not looking at medical workers, but everyone else who's been on the front lines of the pandemic. And why are we looking here at precarious workers and gig workers? Well, traditionally, Americans with fewer resources are not as well prepared for natural disasters, and they're less able to recover from them. And a worldwide pandemic followed by a recession is essentially a 1-2 punch for these workers. We also know that precarious workers often function as canaries in the coal mine in terms of the risks experienced by workers who are in more stable or secure jobs. So since early April, we've actually interviewed more than 175 workers in in-depth interviews that are averaging about an hour and 20 minutes apiece. And we've been talking about workers' experiences and exposure to risk. And so far, what we're finding is not reassuring for other workers as they start to go back to work. Many workers who were deemed essential were scared to work during the pandemic. We had workers reporting experiencing nightmares, trying to convey to bosses that they felt uncomfortable. Many actually specifically asked to be furloughed. Workers who have been called back to work have reported high levels of feeling very nervous, feeling very concerned that they're going to get sick, worried about bringing the COVID back to their families. Those workers who are on the front lines, who are working in grocery stores and drugstores, who are interacting with the public, are reporting they're having to deal with fights between customers, really situations that they do not feel safe. They're having to deal with customers who do not want to wear masks, who are refusing to cover their faces, fights between customers who feel like they're not socially distancing from each other. In terms of unemployment, the unemployment right now partnered with the pandemic unemployment assistance. For many workers in precarious jobs, they are making more money on unemployment, but they are very conscious of the fact that this is a temporary situation. And many of them are actually kind of bored at home. They'd like to go back to work, but they don't feel like it's particularly safe. Work for many of these workers gives, and for actually many of us, gives stability to our day, makes it easier to keep track of what day of the week it is. And so we're seeing that actually a large number of workers are trying to counterbalance this need for work with this need to be safe. And so they're looking online for jobs that they can do while they're at home. And this is actually leading to workers finding a large number of scammers that are reaching out to them for work. So they're finding that some of the jobs that they're applying for are actually thinly veiled attempts to steal their identity or to recruit them into illicit behavior. So, we'll pay you a certain amount of money to pick up packages for us at the post office. Or some workers have actually reported applying for nanny jobs that would not be remote, but that would involve perhaps not as high a level of exposure to risk as a more public-facing job. And they've actually been recruited or experienced attempts to recruit them for sex work. We, as part of our research, are also interviewing workers in creative industries like film and performance. These workers are not going to be able to return to work in New York City until phase 4, which is probably not going to happen until the end of summer or even early fall. And these work, which of course will be after the PUA benefits expire. These workers are particularly concerned about what is going to happen to them. They are facing increased competition for a limited number of industry jobs that can be done remotely, things like at-home video editing or content developing. They don't have a lot of experience in other fields, so they're not particularly optimistic about finding jobs outside that industry. And they're experiencing a lot of mental health issues as a result. Young workers are especially vulnerable right now, especially those workers who are in creative industries. In many cases, they haven't grown particularly accustomed to the precarity of their work, They don't necessarily have go-to strategies or savings that will allow them to cope with the risk. And so for many of these young workers, they're actually having to move back home. They're having to touch on the safety net offered by relatives. And they're struggling financially, emotionally, and in some cases physically. We also have been interviewing restaurant workers. And these workers are also very much looking forward to returning to work, but they are particularly concerned about the risks of being back out in the public. They are also very worried that when they go back to work, they're going to be making not only less than they were making on the pandemic unemployment assistance and unemployment, but also making less than they were making before. There will be fewer diners. A lot of the restaurants are going to have a hard time coping with the restrictions on the number of people who can be present. And workers are worried that there will be stiffer competition for shifts and also for tips from the customers. We are also seeing that the benefits of the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Act are not being felt evenly. So not all workers have been able to take this time to sort of better prepare themselves for the job market or to work on developing their skills. Workers, of course, who have children, which a number of our respondents do, are having a hard time. They're not getting a break from childcare. Many of them are having to help teach their children. And we are seeing that they're struggling with this idea of going back to work. There is one, I always hesitate to call it a silver lining, but we are seeing that for some workers who are receiving PUA and receiving the maximum unemployment, which in New York ends up being a little over $500 a week, these workers, if they were precarious before and struggling, are sometimes being able to use this time to work on changing industries. They are working on developing skills. They're taking classes online. They're doing some of the free webinars that have popped up. And all of this is a way for them to possibly hit reset on their careers and go back into the job market, hopefully in a better situation. But for many workers, this is an incredibly stressful time, and they are worried about the future of their jobs. They're worried about going back into roles where they will have to be interacting with people, and they are concerned about job security going forward. All of this really points to the idea that we very much need to be helping workers with continuing to expand the pandemic unemployment assistance or offer options like Paige was just talking about of having the partial unemployment.
Great. Thank you, Professor Ravenel and Professor Ouimet. Those were both really fascinating discussions. I should say at the outset, I feel like I'm here a little bit under false pretenses, meaning that rather than demystifying all the various workplace law issues going on right now, my bigger point of emphasis is going to be to point out exactly how mystifying they really are. And one of the sort of interesting things about the current COVID crisis is the degree to which it's both highlighted and exacerbated many of the issues that have already sort of plagued workplace laws. And what I really mean by that is the fact that the governance over workplaces in the US, unlike most other countries which tend to use this very centralized system, there may be even one sort of labor law governed by a single agency, right? Both for historical and other reasons, right? We have a system that's, one governed by two, maybe three governing bodies, federal, state, possibly local. Even within a certain system, let's say the federal one, again, as I said, rather than being a single labor code, we typically have, over time, various statutes that are then enforced by an alphabet soup of different agencies, all of which have, varying degrees of coverage and enforcement mechanisms that really differ. And in fact, even for the same type of claim involving the same parties, you might have multiple laws with different rules and enforcement mechanisms cover them, which even in the best of times can be quite confusing. Even if you're a high wage worker who is able to afford attorney, what we're seeing, sort of, similar to what Professor Ravenel is talking about with some of the gig workers, if you have a low wage worker, however, who can't, either is not sophisticated or can't afford a lawyer, really their chance of even enforcing the laws that do protect them can be quite low. And so what I want to do is just sort of do a broad overview of some of the various and most pressing issues that we're seeing now. And during the Q&A period, I'm happy to discuss, along with my fellow panelists, any particular issues. And one way to think about this is maybe imagine a small business right now. You've got a business that's actually trying to do the right thing. For instance, they want to keep the workplace safe. One pressing question they've got, again, building on Professor Ravenel's work, is are they even an employer, right? If there's a lot of legal question about whether certain workers, gig ones being in particular, are employees that are covered by various workplace laws. Are they independent contractors that aren't? In which case laws don't apply to them at all, or at least most of the laws I'm going to be talking about. Even if they are an employer, they have to figure out how big of an employer they are, because several of the laws, most of them in fact, have what are referred to as small employer exceptions. So they might be covered by some laws, but not covered by others. And then just looking more at even just what safety measures do they need to follow, right? It can be confusing. A lot of states are governed just simply by the federal OSHA. Other states, like North Carolina, have their own set of safety regulations that need to at least follow OSHA, but can add things. Even under the current COVID crisis, it's been questionable sort of what employers need to do, because OSHA hasn't put out any new legally required standards. There's quite a bit of guidance from OSHA, state level agencies, the CDC, but those aren't legally constraining. So it's confusing as to exactly what an employer actually must do. And then, of course, there are other laws too, right? So for instance, the Americans with Disability Act comes into play as to, if you're the employer and you want to, let's say, do temperature checks or keep track of employees that have been exposed to or might have contracted COVID. The ADA regulates what questions you can ask that are medical related, and then the confidentiality that might apply to those, as well as any potential reasonable accommodations you need to make, right? There are other discrimination laws that might come into play too. You might have to watch out for harassment based on national origin, for instance, or we've seen some instances where employers have wanted to treat older employees who are obviously more susceptible and treat them differently. There's a federal statute that prohibits or might limit the extent to which they can do that. And let's say that the employer, either despite their best efforts or because their efforts weren't particularly good, still has significant safety concerns, or at least what the workers view as being significant. What are they supposed to do? What many of them probably don't know is that they can't enforce safety regulations on their own. They have to go to OSHA or the relevant state agency. Assuming they don't know that, what options do they have? Can they, for instance, protest? Or just simply refuse to go to work? Do they put their job at jeopardy if they do that? One of the sort of key characteristics of American workplace law is this sort of at-will rule that basically says you can get fired or quit for any reason at all. There are exceptions to that. So if there were, for instance, your employer was violating the law and you could prove it, that might be an exception. If you, for instance, protest with fellow employees, you actually might be covered by federal labor law, even though you're not unionized, which most people don't know about, including employers. So those are some added issues there. And then, of course, a follow-up to that is, let's say the worker does refuse to go to work and in fact gets fired. There's a bunch of questions that follow from that, most particularly sort of following on Professor Ouimet's presentation. Are they eligible for unemployment insurance still? In North Carolina, they may be. There's, at least 7 different reasons why someone might still be if they, for instance, were diagnosed with COVID. or if there was a significant risk because the employer wasn't following required safety guidelines. But there's a lot of questions as to whether that may or may not apply that really makes it risky for a worker who's fearful for their safety to actually refuse to go to work. Sort of another question that I noticed somebody had asked earlier, what if an employee does get COVID and they think it might be because that they might have been exposed at work? And that's an excellent question because it's a little unclear exactly what will happen. Typically, that's covered by a workers' compensation program, which means they have to go through workers' compensation. They can't file for a tort suit. But depending on the state, that can be very difficult to get benefits. In North Carolina, like frankly most states, the employee would actually have to prove that they got it at work, which would be tough. Other states like California has made more of a legal presumption that they were exposed at work. But for states that didn't do that, that's going to be really tough. And then finally, I'll just note that, with the new benefits, both the unemployment benefits that we've heard about, there's also quite a few family and medical leave benefits, including unique for the US, paid leave under certain circumstances. Right, there's several different measures that apply under various different circumstances that both employers and employees are going to be struggling to make sure that they are actually able to take advantage of the benefits that they're entitled to. And again, I've been teaching and researching this area of law for longer than I care to admit, and I still don't feel like I've got a full handle on it. And so to the extent that low-wage workers or a small business owner who's already struggling with the current environment is going to be able to really get a grasp on what their legal duties and rights are. A lot of people are going to frankly fall through the gaps, and that's one thing that we'll need to watch out for. And research like Professor Ravenel's will be important to see really sort of where the law has been able to do what it's supposed to do and where it's failed to live up to its promise. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing those insights. It's very helpful. I know we have a few questions already in the queue. I want to remind folks, I know we have a number of researchers on the line and also members of the press. We are going to try to give preference in which questions we pose to members of the press. So if you have not had a chance to submit your questions yet, you're welcome to do so either using that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or by emailing me. Again, my email address is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. So we're going to get things kicked off with the first question is from a researcher, which you'll know once I read the question, and it's for the group. So economist Paul Romer has suggested that testing on a massive scale is the swiftest way to instill confidence in our citizens, and that confidence is the key to our nation's economic rehabilitation. Although it would cost $8 to $10 billion a month, he maintains that this is cheaper than the financial consequences of staying at home or social distancing and contact tracing. If the answer is truly this simple, should we be diverting our resources into testing versus offsetting economic losses? And I'll open that up for the group.
Well, I'm happy to speak a bit to this. So I think the idea that we can test our way out of this is a fantastic idea, but it does depend on the science. So we need to be confident that we are not getting false negatives. And at this point, I think that is one of the concerns. And the other issue is, could you be contagious prior to showing up positive on a test? And so I think those science questions still need to be addressed. But otherwise, again, if we could really identify people who are clearly not potentially contagious, this could have huge advantages as opposed to necessarily requiring all of these social distancing measures.
Excellent. Jeff, did you want to add to that?
No, I'm going to stick with Professor Ouimet.
Sounds great. Our next question is, if there's a projection that there might be a second wave of COVID later this year, some states are obviously already experiencing the beginnings of that, what can be done to help prepare workers and employers for occasional flare-ups? Will governments need to prepare to extend some of the safety nets for workers?
Yeah, I guess I'll leap in there, but others can jump in. Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is yes. And obviously, we've seen political tangling already about the extent to which unemployment benefits are going to be extended. Several of the new ones are due to expire towards the end of July. So I think that's going to be an important one. It's not like all of a sudden the economic stressors are going to be lifted. And to me, I mean, one of the bigger concerns that I've been having is again, the safety regulation has been a real problem. I mean, OSHA over decades has been pretty underfunded. And I think, they've only had one workplace violation over the last couple of years or something crazy like that. And, if we are actually want to keep workers safe, and remember, that's going to keep us safe too. I mean, we should care about workers, but to the extent you don't, you should care about yourself. And, you're going to, as we all know, things spread quickly, right? There needs to be investment in enforcement. And right now, people can't sue on their own. You have to go to the agency who then has to inspect or investigate. And so that, I think, really needs to get invested in more heavily and quickly.
Great, thank you. Alexandria, did you want to add to that?
Yes. So I definitely think that we need to have clear plans on how to sort of pull back on reopenings. And we definitely do need to expand this safety net. Some workers still haven't been able to get their unemployment, or they don't know if they're eligible for it. And so we definitely need to sort of expand access to that, and also communications about what options there are for workers when they're struggling.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Our next question comes from Matthias. I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, Matthias Miller. What do employees need to know to legally protect them as they return to the workplace? The laws are complex, but are there some essential guidelines or resources for how employees can prepare?
I wish. Yeah, I mean, again, this is the problem is there's not a very clear sort of one-page pamphlet that employees can use to help determine sort of what their protections are, what they need to do. I will say a lot of agencies that govern in this area, not all, but a lot of them tend to be good about, if somebody calls them up, for instance, and it happens to be an area that they don't have jurisdiction over, they'll point folks over to the appropriate agency, right? But that takes, again, more sophisticated workers who have more time, who don't have kids at home, who aren't working a ton, right? They have the time and the energy to sort of hunt things out. The unfortunate thing is a lot of precarious workers, again, Professor Ravenel talked about this, right? The sad thing is they just don't have the time. They don't have the resources. They're trying to make ends meet at a very dire stage of their lives. And just our system is built in a way that is very reactive. It requires oftentimes folks to come to the government agencies rather than the other way around. And that just oftentimes doesn't work. And so I wish I had a good answer to that, but I don't.
It's a tough question. I think we're all kind of figuring out the answers as we go along. The next one is of specific interest to me as someone who recently did a round of returns with my mask on and saw a lot of people in masks and a lot of people not in masks. Do employers have the right to obligate their staff to wear masks while at work?
This is legal day here. Yeah, they do. One, obviously, when you're in a situation where the government, right, phase 2, for instance, requires masks in a certain situation, obviously they can require people to follow the law. And in fact, that's one of the exceptions to an employee maybe not having a right to sue over their termination would be if the employer, for instance, didn't allow them to wear a mask. We've been seeing that case some. So that could be a help to employees. But certainly, frankly, even if it's not required, again, there might be some sort of really rare exceptions based on some special circumstances where it could be a problem. But yeah, typically, you're a private business, you can require people to wear masks, particularly if there's some sort of safety issue.
And this is a follow-up on that. While we're on the legal train, I'm just going to knock out a few others that we've received. Another is the flip side of that. Do businesses have the right to not serve employees who do not wear masks?
Right to not serve employees or not serve customers?
Not serve customers, rather, sorry. Yeah, no, not
absolutely.
serve customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, that they can, basically, unless there's some sort of legal requirement that they do, in fact, serve people. So, for instance, you can't discriminate based on race, even though it's your private business. But there's no, I don't like to wear mask protection, legal protection, right? And so employers or any business is allowed to say, look, no mask, no service.
Great. We've got a couple other follow-ups on the legal side, so I'm glad you've got your water handy.
That's right.
I'll ask these grouped together, and then we can move on to some of the other questions we've received. But the first is, while employees may not be able to sue directly, should employers be worried about long-term negligence lawsuits due to COVID? And then second part of that, Jeff, I think would also be for you, is if an employee inadvertently infects their coworkers, could the employee be held liable for creating an unsafe workspace?
Yeah, those are really good questions. My very general answer is for the latter one, no. Typically, particularly if an inadvertent exposure isn't going to be enough under tort laws, you have to be negligent, reckless, something like that. If someone, purposely coughed on somebody, that might open them up to legal liability. On the employer side, again, as I mentioned really briefly, most of those suits will go through workers' comp system, which is exclusive. It's I won't get into the details of that, but that's intended to be a sort of all-encompassing system for workplace injuries. I will say there have been a couple of suits filed recently, and which I think maybe the question's touching on, dealing with, there's this concept of a public nuisance, which is kind of this general tort claim. There's real legal questions about whether that's going to be what's called preempted by workers' comp, whether those types of suits will be allowed to proceed. It's unclear to me whether they will or not. It's a little bit of a legal Wild West at this point. But I think what you're seeing, though, is, again, there's a problem, or there's a perceived problem, that the current workers' comp system, for instance, isn't doing enough, or at least isn't doing enough for certain people. And so what they're seeking are these sort of nuisance and other claims to try to either improve incentives for employers or get compensation for what's, a very serious harm.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next question in from a reporter, Catherine. We don't know the scope of the coronavirus in the workplace due to a lack of reporting. Should businesses be required to report COVID cases in the workplace? And Paige or Alexandria, this may be one for you.
Paige, do you want?
Well, I would actually be very interested in Jeff's response, because I wonder if there's any legal issues with disclosing this information about your employees.
Yeah.
You're back on the spot, Jeff. I tried to save you that time. Sorry.
Keep filling these hours. No, I will say that's been, I've even noticed in the news in North Carolina that there's been an issue about whether the state will start requiring employers to report on this. I totally agree, right? Obviously, from a public health standpoint and employee safety standpoint, it's incredibly important to have that information. Right now, this goes back to some of my earlier points about whether or not COVID exposure is covered by OSHA. And there's this sort of general duty to keep the workplace safe that it may well be, but then there's a secondary question whether the reporting requirements are actually kick in. And there's a more complex set of rules. Usually, you have a workplace accident, for instance, at a construction site. Those are types of things that need to be reported. Exposure to a a pandemic is not something necessarily that the reporting gets kicked in. So I think right now there's a demand for more government intervention. Say, look, we need this information. There's going to be confidentiality concerns, and there's ways of addressing that. Yeah, I think right now that's a gap, and it's a little bit left up in the air and left to employers to decide the degree to which they want to report.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Paige or Alexandria, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I would just add, it would be critical that this information is made available on as close to real time as possible. And that would be a big challenge, but I think it would need to be as close to real time and in some sort of dashboard so that both the employees and potential consumers could be aware of it. But again, I leave the legal issues to Jeff.
Great, thank you. Our next question, and I'm thinking this is coming your way, Paige. If we have another wave of COVID in the late fall or early winter, what would happen if instead of the mass layoffs we've seen, we see more reduced hours? Do you think that we would see more of the partial unemployment insurance offered? And long term, do you think that partial unemployment will become more used?
I do think so. So we've seen this in Europe. Europe has much lower unemployment numbers than we have. There's a lot of sort of arguments that this seems to be a more humane way to deal with people, both sort of avoiding that harsh separation from your employer, but at the same time, it also seems to be more efficient economically. It allows us to keep these productive worker firm matches and allows companies to be more nimble. And I think that is exactly what we need in a world where we are potentially going to have these second waves. So if you had a short-time compensation plan, it'd be very easy to immediately flip to partial hours, get your workers compensated through this program. I would argue if we make any changes, one thing we could do would be possibly increase the amount of compensation. So typically the way these programs are implemented in Europe, you would receive more like 75, 80% of your wages would be fully replaced as opposed to some of these maximum amounts that we see across states. But it does seem like these programs are receiving more attention, and I expect they will become even more used going forward. It is a very effective way to deal with, especially these waves.
One thing I'll just jump on, if you don't mind. I know I've talked to a couple of lawyers who represent employers, and one thing that they've said is it struck them how much employers have even wanted to take advantage of this program, that they've been, how can we actually help our employees out? So I think the sort of, as Paige said, the kind of win-win aspect of this has been really important.
That's great. And this, please jump in, Alexandria.
Sorry, okay, jump in.
No,
sorry, I couldn't find the hand button. So we're actually doing follow-up interviews with the workers that we're interviewing now. So we're doing follow-up interviews in the fall or early winter when the second wave comes, because it probably will. And we're finding right now actually is that a lot of workers are actually turning to gig work when they can't get unemployment. So I think if we don't see an increase in partial unemployment options, we will see more and more workers turning to gig work as sort of a new social safety net, which will then expose them even more because a lot of these jobs are very much front facing. They're going all over the city, going into people's private homes.
Yeah, I think my Instacart shopper was the only person I interacted with in any way, shape, or form for a number of months. So I agree with that. I think that's the right assessment. The next question actually is about gig workers and for you, Alexandria. What long-term effects might this have on gig work? Do you see a greater interest from policymakers during and beyond the pandemic to provide protections for this class of workers?
I think, yes, that's the short answer. The longer answer is, the pandemic unemployment assistance is the first time that we've actually offered unemployment assistance to independent contractors. And I think this is really showing this recognition that these are workers just like those who are in W-2 employment situations. And if anything, they're even more vulnerable. In terms of the longer term effects on gig work, we've seen so many people who were not able to get unemployment, or it was so delayed that they were turning to gig work. And that's actually causing an imbalance in terms of supply and demand. So workers who were doing Postmates food delivery are finding that there's not as many pickups for them to do because there are all these new delivery workers who previously worked in offices or previously had more stable jobs, and now they're turning to this gig work. And we're also seeing that certain jobs like Uber and Lyft drivers, those jobs have essentially dried up with social distancing and the need for people to follow stay-at-home orders.
That's right. Jeff, you touched on this earlier when you mentioned that, employees have rights to kind of lobby as a group, even if they're not part of a union, and that people may not fully understand that. We got a question on that. Do you think we will see a rise in union activity given the high unemployment and the safety issues, or do you think workers will find other avenues to make their voices heard?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's an interesting sort of tension going on. Oftentimes, union activity will actually decrease when the labor market's poor, just because people are scared for their jobs, and for reasons I won't dive into too much here, it's really risky to engage in that type of activity in spite of laws that protect it. On the other hand, right, as we've seen. Both, I think, right, two issues going on. One, all the questions about COVID and the safety. We've seen a lot of industries, Amazon, other places, workers have been collectively pushing back against what they see are poor working conditions. Plus, I have to say, right, the Black Lives Matter stuff that's going on now too is another, particularly sharp instance of collective action, not in a traditional formal union sense, but it is an instance where people are getting together and pushing for change. And so I frankly, it's risky to predict anything, but I would say probably at least in the short term, we will see more and continue to see more activity like that. Again, not necessarily in just the formal, I want to unionize sense, but in, I don't need a union. I can, sometimes it's called alt labor. I can join together and push for better conditions. We saw teachers, right, in states like North Carolina that don't have labor protections still did that. So I suspect we'll see an uptick for a while and continue. We actually have seen and continue to. What happens kind of, after a year or two, that I don't know.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. The next question is also touching on something that you mentioned during your remarks, and I'll share with you the original question, and then I'll kind of caveat it with what you said. The original question is, older workers are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. What can employers do to ensure worker safety? I know you mentioned earlier that there are some limitations around, some ageism policies and laws that are already in place. How can employers be safe and be mindful of vulnerable populations, whether by age or by other status?
Yeah, and so this is, again, an example. We've got a couple different statutes overlapping each other. And I know the EEOC, which is the federal agency that oversees discrimination law, has put out guidance saying that the employers cannot essentially tell older workers you can't come to work because you're at higher risk. So you're not allowed to do that. But it might require employers to provide some added protections for those workers, either maybe a temporary change in job duties to reduce their exposure, protective equipment. It's obviously very job or industry dependent. So it's good that employers are thinking about, well, what do we need to do to best protect our workers? I'll note workers with disabilities or other sort of medical issues that might make them susceptible. This comes into play as well. But yeah, it's very sort of fact specific. But what they can't do is just say you're older. So we'll see you in a couple months.
Got it. That makes sense. The second also touches on something that you mentioned earlier, and I'm curious as to what your take is on this, because I think it applies to most people who are here on this webinar. If a worker is not vulnerable, him or herself, but is quarantining with someone who is, what options does that worker have if he or she doesn't feel safe returning to work, not because of his or her personal health, but because of the health of a family member or or friend they're quarantining with?
Yeah, and so again, maybe two different levels. One is just simply if their job is protected, if they refuse to come to work. So there is, as part of the new Family First Coronavirus Act, there are leave protections that might apply to them if they are either caring for someone who has COVID, or there's some other specifics. Basically, a child, daughter, family member, or someone else who's affected by COVID, you might be entitled to a combination of paid or unpaid leave. Again, not all employers are covered by that. It depends the size of your employer and how long you've worked for the employer. If either the leave doesn't apply to you, or you've used up all your leave, then you really don't have sort of a legal right to refuse to come to work. What you might have, and this gets a bit in the Paige's discussion, is if you say, look, I just don't feel comfortable, even though I don't have a legal right to refuse to work, your employer says, sorry, I need somebody, then you might be entitled to unemployment benefits still, just because some of the newer benefits there. But yeah, you're a little bit caught in a tough bind there, which unfortunately we're seeing quite a bit of.
Yep. No, thank you for that response. Our next question has been emailed in, so don't mind me as I read this from my phone. Do you think it would be possible that the federal government will do away with estimated employer taxes rather, or provide other tax breaks to self-employed workers?
Paige, yeah.
So this has certainly been one of the discussions on the table. It is not one of my favorite approaches, mainly because when we think about the vulnerable workers, we think about the workers, these are the individuals who are earning low wages. At a low wage level, they have not been able to save up significantly in order to create a buffer to deal with things. And they just don't pay taxes. Or if they do, they pay very low taxes. And so tax rebates really are not going to impact the people that I think we need to care most about right now.
Great, thank you, Paige. And I know that you had a couple questions for your fellow panelists, and I'm happy to pose those on your behalf. But Paige had a question for Jeff. What can we do right now to ensure that all workplaces are safe, or at least are adopting best practices? And what government entity or entities need to act on this?
Yeah, and that gets back to, I think, one of the reporter questions as well. Right, that's where you either need OSHA or the state equivalent to pass. I mean, the OSHA has a option to pass temporary or emergency, rules. They announced a while ago that they were not going to do that. Admittedly, oftentimes the few times they've tried it in the past, courts have not been very receptive. But I think, frankly, even in the short term, I mean, litigation takes a while. If they really wanted to have an impact quickly, they could pass some or promulgate some quite quickly. And I think that would have the biggest impact, because it would be clear. It would actually be a legal responsibility rather than a mere guideline. And then just enforce, right? And that's, again, a resource problem. But some high profile, shut down a meatpacking plant, go after an Amazon warehouse. I don't mean to pick on those particular businesses, but obviously they've been in the news. And I think that sends a message. And so it's a question of sort of enforcement priorities, or just priority to enforce.
Definitely. This vegetarian has had a hard time finding her tofu recently, so I think the
Me as well.
yeah. Everybody's a little frightened of any sort of meatpacking plant these days. Paige also had a question for Alexandria, and Alexandria, I think you touched on some aspects of this earlier, but I'll let you expound a bit. Are there some aspects of gig economy work that are beneficial during COVID? Obviously, the risks are pretty inherent in most of the work that you've described. And then she also followed up, and this was before you had explained a bit more, but do you see workers who are in traditional paid employment moving into gig economy jobs? And I'll caveat that with permanently. We know that we're seeing that in the short term. Do you see that being a long-term effect of the pandemic?
So yes, I am worried that we will see workers where their full-time stable job has essentially disappeared and won't be coming back. In some of my earlier work looking at gig workers and then following up with them 4 and 5 years later, a lot of workers who thought that they were returning to gig work as temporary are still in that work. especially if they are older and if they turn to gig work and we're doing it for more than about 6 to 9 months. There's a risk with gig work that you end up stigmatized and stuck in that work. As one worker said to me, I'd love to get a job using my college degree in English, doing copywriting, but how do I explain to an employer, oh, I've been doing food delivery for DoorDash and Postmates for 4 years, and now I'd like to use my English degree. Like, those skills don't really translate from dodging traffic to being in an office again and crafting words on a page. I think that there's a lot of gray in the gig economy. So some jobs that people can do from home that are remote work, I think are a positive way for people to be making some money. So, but a lot of those jobs can be still concerning in terms of the potential for ergonomic issues. If you're doing transcription for long periods of time and you're typing, you might end up with carpal tunnel that actually makes it harder for you to get another job later on. And I'm especially concerned about the people who are having to turn to gig work when they're having major delays in getting their unemployment, or when their unemployment suddenly stops and there's no other option available for them. These gig economy companies have sort of painted themselves as entrepreneurship for the masses or a social safety net. And when we see workers actually turning to that, it can have some troubling ramifications.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we are bumping right up on time. And so I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. I know we didn't get to answer all of your questions. So if you would like to schedule a follow-up conversation with any of the experts you've heard from today, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to set that up. Again, thank you for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to be here amid what is a very, very chaotic period for everyone in a number of different ways. We really appreciate your time and your attention, and look forward to speaking with you soon. We'll be gathering again for another press briefing in a couple weeks, so stay tuned for more details on that. Until then, take good care, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you soon.